Hey everyone, welcome back to Basic Level Gaming. Glad to have you with us. Today we are going to continue on with our Learning to Play Chess series. We are going to talk about how you actually capture the other player's pieces. Last time we talked about how to make the moves, and in some cases the captures are a little different or a little more complicated. Today we're just going to talk about basic capture concepts. I'm going to touch on one that's a little more advanced that we'll go into a little more later. But if you have not seen the video on the basic moves, and you're not familiar with how exactly each piece moves, definitely go watch that video first, and then come back and watch this one because you'll want to have that basic understanding. It'll make today's video make a lot more sense. So we are going to jump in here. I've got a bunch of pictures of the board and with different pieces and stuff on it. You're going to see some pretty crude drawings with a highlighter on the board indicating some of the movements. I'm going to work on how to make that more refined. Right now that was the easiest way that I could see to be able to bring that in for you and be able to show the pieces actually moving. So we're going to work with that today. So ultimately the first thing we want to look at is some of the more powerful pieces and how they capture, because they're going to have the most flexibility. Basically how you capture a piece in general is you move your piece with a legal move for that piece to the same square that the opponent's piece is on, and then you take their piece off the board, and that piece is captured. They no longer have the use of that piece. Obviously, the more pieces you capture, the less they have to work with to put you in check and take the game, which we'll talk more about check a little bit today as well. So I'm going to start off with, we're going to work with the queen first. And this first image has actually several pieces on it here we're going to work with. I found one that kind of shows how a lot of pieces can capture. So first of all, the queen, if you remember right, can go in any direction as far as it's open. So if there's a piece in the way, it can't jump over a piece. On this board state here, you can see that the queen has a direct connection to the rook. And capturing the rook also is a great thing because it's one of the more powerful pieces. So you would just take your queen and you'd move it along this yellow line right here. The yellow lines are all the ways that the queen could go to capture. And along this yellow line, you just move it straight over here and you set it down in place of the rook and you take the rook off the board, and that's captured. And ultimately, what you want to make sure is that if you're going to take a piece, there isn't another piece that could take you, if at all possible. Now, if you're taking a piece worth more, so like if you have a knight taking a queen, you're definitely taking a better piece. So even if they take your knight, you're still in a better shape. But if you can take them without losing your piece, that's obviously best. Just like the queen can take the rook, in this particular setup, if it was black's turn to move, black could take the queen. Because remember, the rooks can go along these, I don't know, those are like a pink purplish color lines. So anywhere that they could go along those lines, it could capture. So the rook could take the queen if it's black's turn to move. Those two, they're pretty simple because they can go as far as they need to in any direction. Well, rooks can't go diagonal, but you know what I mean. Just generally, they have a lot more flexibility in where they could capture. Now, if we move over here to the bishop, where you can see that it's against the edge of the board, so it can only go diagonal. So it only has two paths that it could actually capture on. And remember, it's a dark squared bishop, so it has to stay on the dark squares. So if, say, right here below the queen, if the queen was one square down, then the bishop could take the queen. So that's kind of how the bishop's going to capture. It's going to work the same way, it's just only on the diagonals. The knight here, you'll see these red lines here, or orange I think is actually what the highlighter was, but it looks red. The knight, remember, moves 2 and 1, so it moves in like an L shape here. In any, you can go 2 up and 1 over, or 2 over and 1 up, or 1 down. Ultimately, anywhere that these red lines stop. So you don't actually capture a piece with a knight by moving over it. You have to actually land on the square that the other piece is in. So right now, if this was a white knight, you would see that it could capture the king, which is obviously not good. That's the end of the game if the king gets captured. So the knight's a little hard one to remember where you can capture, but one of the really cool things about the knight, because of how it moves, is that it can be sneaky. You don't always see where a knight is going to capture, especially if the knight wasn't the last piece to move. So like if the knight was just sitting there and the board was being changed and everything was playing, and all of a sudden the queen moved here to catch the bishop and didn't notice this knight, then the knight could jump in and take the queen. So that's a big advantage for the knight if you're working with that to try to capture other pieces. So those are the major pieces that you're going to work with, is the queen, the rook, the knight, and the bishop. Now, the next thing that you're going to have is that the king can actually capture as well. So you'll see here on this board, I've got the white king down here with some red or orange lines coming off of it. The king can only move 1 square, so it doesn't often end up in a situation where it can capture, especially not a more powerful piece like the rook here. But if it is white's turn to move right now, then the king could take the rook, which would be a big switch for the white team right here. Because right now the white has the queen, but you'll see black also has all these pawns, and we talked before about how the pawns can be very powerful pieces given certain situations. So getting that rook out of there really kind of cripples black in this situation. It's worth noting here, and I didn't draw lines, but if you see where the queen is right now, the queen does have a couple of captures here. If it goes straight up the board, then it could take this pawn, and we'll talk about in a moment here why that would not be a good idea. I'm going to save the pawns for last because they just work on a little bit different rule. So we're going to save them for last. But if it took this pawn, you're going to lose your queen. The other pawn that it could capture is over here, which seems okay. I mean, there's no other pawns around it. There's no big pieces. But if you do that, then the rook right here, the black rook, could move up and take the queen. And then that's very much going to cripple the white team because they don't have anything left but the king, and that's very, very, well, it's impossible to win the game with only the king. You'll be looking more for getting a draw, which we'll talk about the ways to make that happen in another video. So that's really the important part of this board state here. The next thing I want to look at is how, well, let's talk a little bit real quick if it's your king that's in trouble. So if you look at this one here, you'll see that along this red or orange line here, the queen has a direct line to the king. That is called check. And what that means is you have to respond to check. You cannot move a different piece. Like let's say there was a rook, a black rook over here in the corner. You cannot move that rook unless it was able to capture the piece attacking your king. And there's a lot more to that. We'll go into some really good depth on checking and checkmating down the road. Checkmate means you're in check and you have no way to get out of it, and that's the end of the game. But I just wanted to kind of point out, if your king is the one in trouble, you absolutely have to respond to it. You cannot leave it the way it is. Also, if this black king was over one square to the left, it could not move to the square it's on now because it would be moving into check, and you can't end your turn in check. And that can get a lot more complicated. I just wanted to give a general idea of how that works. You have to keep your king from being captured. And we're going to look at a couple other situations with check here in this video as well. So the next thing that I definitely want to touch base on is there's one piece we haven't really talked about yet, and that is the pawns. Pawns work a little differently. And you'll see on this one here we've got a couple of pawns. The normal movement for a pawn, like we talked about, is only straight up the board. They can't move diagonal, they can't move backwards, and they can't move sideways. The exception to that is when they capture a piece, they don't capture straight ahead. They only capture on the forward diagonals. So like if you look at these pawns here, on the white pawn I've got the little red lines, and on the black pawn I've got the purple lines. So for the black pawn, there's nothing to capture there. So it can't move. It's stuck because it can't move straight because there's another piece in the way, and there's nothing for it to capture. So like if you look at the four pawns over here on the side of the board, they can't move. There's nothing for them to do, so they're just kind of stuck. This pawn, however, the white pawn in the kind of the middle of the board, it has a piece that it can capture. It can capture this black knight. So just like on the other pieces, you capture a piece by moving into its square. So you would take the pawn, put it in the place of the knight, and put the knight off the board. This is super important because I talked about how you can't put a king in check. So you can't move a king like where this knight was. The black king could not be there. So later on, when you're trying to trap the king, these squares being pinned is important. So, and not only that, but it's important you can capture, it doesn't matter if this was a queen, it captures the same way diagonally. So you can do a lot with a pawn. It seems like they're very simplistic pieces, but like I talked about last time, they are actually very powerful. And we'll talk a little bit more next time about promoting the pawns, because that's also a very important basic concept you want to understand. So we'll talk about that there. Now, before we finish up for today, though, I want to look at a couple other situations where the king is in check. So the next one I'm going to look at is this one here. So we've talked about how the knight goes one up and two over, and if it lands in the same square, it captures. So in this situation, the king is in check. If the king moves to the left, because the knight won't actually land on that square, the king is safe. And then that also would typically put the knight in danger because the king captures one square to any direction. One of the concepts that we'll really look at, because it's very important, is being able to have multiple pieces that have your pieces covered so that they can't be just taken. So you've got this white bishop here pointing right at the knight. So the king cannot take that knight, because if it did, then the bishop would put it in check and you can't end your turn in check. So I just wanted to kind of show that concept there. The other thing is, on this piece right here, this really is honestly the end of the game, because whether the king moves to the right or to the left to get out of check, those are the only two options. If white on the next turn takes their rook and moves it all the way to the back row here, then the king cannot get out of check, because it can't take the knight because of the bishop, and it can't move anywhere else on the back row. So it would be the end of the game. So I just kind of wanted to point that out. It's not always that particular move that's going to end the game. A lot of times it's multiple moves and having a lot of pieces protecting each other. So, and to that note, I want to point out another one here. So, and this is the last one we're going to talk about, and this one will go a lot more into some concepts on this piece, or this move right here, because it doesn't feel like the end of the game, but I'll show why it is. So right now, white just moved their bishop to this spot. It has the black king in check. Because the king cannot stay in check, the only thing that black can do here to get out of check is to move their queen down one square, getting in the way of the bishop, which then also feels like, well, it could attack the bishop on the next turn it gets. This pawn right here, I mentioned how these pawns are important. This white pawn, when the queen moves in the way, and the white pawn can then capture the queen, and the king is still in check. So it's not always a given what's going to happen there. Now, in this particular case, it's not really the end of the game, because the queen gets here on the square between the king and the bishop. The white pawn takes the queen. Actually, it is the end of the game. It's just several pieces down the road. But so the white pawn takes the queen. The king is still in check. The only thing the king can do is move where the queen is right now. But there's another piece on the board that's going to cause a problem with that, and that's this white rook down here on the bottom rank. Or on the bottom row. If it goes straight up and goes to this back square right here, the king will not be able to get out of the way. The bishop can get in the way, but then the rook just takes the bishop, and it's still checkmate. So we'll talk about how to start seeing how you're forcing the end of the game, because black really has no choices the whole rest of this game. It only has one move every time. And that's what you want to have happen. If you can make it to where the other person has to do what benefits you, then you've got it. So, and we'll talk about ways to see that, ways to help that. Those are some more advanced concepts we'll get into. I just wanted to show that capturing is very easy on the basic level, but it can get much more complicated. So that's where we're going to end today. Like I said, I wanted to just kind of cover those captures. We've covered all the different pieces. The next time, we're going to talk a little bit more about check and checkmate and how to know how many pieces in advance and things like that, how far in advance you need to look at. We're also going to talk about the value of the pieces and how it might be a good idea to sacrifice your piece if you're going to capture a piece that's more important. So those are some of the concepts we're going to talk about next time. So hopefully you'll join us. I definitely appreciate you being with us today. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you get our updates. We do upload on this series every Tuesday and Thursday. So we will see you back again on Tuesday. And have a great day.